I would like to welcome Miriam. No, no, sorry, Miriam's not the first. Berenice to to speak.
Buenas tardes a todas, todos y todes. Un fraterno y caluroso saludo. En buena hora saludamos este foro. Lo estábamos esperando de manera ansiosa por todas las circunstancias que estamos viviendo actualmente en el mundo, particularmente en el sur global, profundamente preocupados por la situación de los últimos meses en América Latina y el Caribe. Como ustedes saben, bueno, soy defensora de derechos humanos, defensora de los derechos de los pueblos, y en ese marco recientemente tuvimos un foro en México para analizar la situación tanto de los defensores de derechos humanos como de los defensores de la naturaleza, con unos resultados bastante lamentables en torno a la pérdida de vidas de defensoras y defensores, tanto en México y en Colombia, que son los dos países que tienen el índice más alto de asesinatos, pero en otros países de Centroamérica como Honduras, Guatemala y Nicaragua. Los desafíos en los que nos encontramos actualmente tienen que ver justamente con cómo ese sistema internacional de protección, tanto de Naciones Unidas como de la OEA, de la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos, a la par de que aumentan los conflictos, van minimizando su acción en la región. Eso lo vimos como una de las prácticas y patrones generales en toda América Latina y Centroamérica. El ascenso de las economías ilegales se atraviesan también como un patrón de acumulación, y eso hace pensar que justamente estos conflictos que se han dado en las tres últimas décadas decaen actualmente en una situación de macroestructuras criminales que pierden esa esencia que en los años 80, 90 estaba plenamente identificada por quienes hacían análisis de las políticas de seguridad a nivel internacional. Esas políticas de seguridad a nivel internacional lo hemos visto con Colombia y lo estamos viendo también con México, pese a algunas transiciones políticas, como en el caso colombiano, el hecho de que desde el 2022 se tenga un gobierno progresista, pues no trasladan esas demandas políticas a la realidad del conflicto armado. Yo quiero presentar unos mapas que nos pueden apoyar un poco en la identificación de los patrones que encontramos. Por un lado, el mantenimiento de la eliminación sistemática de defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos. Por otro lado, el hecho de que pese a que se han generado algunas políticas globales en términos de derecho a la naturaleza, caso México, caso Colombia, se ha avanzado un poco en este marco de legislación interna y legislación internacional, acuerdos de Escazú, por ejemplo, y otros acuerdos que se han dado también en la región. No logramos que estos acuerdos se cumplan. No, no sé por qué no puedo compartir. Estoy intentándolo, pero ellos nos muestran como los conflictos que están activados en la región. Katy, voy a pasártelo a ti a ver si lo puedes compartir desde allá, porque no me fue posible compartirlo desde acá para no interrumpir lo que estoy planteando. Eh, en este sentido, digamos que los sujetos colectivos que han generado propuestas importantes de defensa de derechos humanos, de defensa de la naturaleza, son quienes de alguna manera en los últimos 4 años, según lo que establecimos en este foro, están en la mira de estos actores armados, de estos actores que son difusos de alguna manera porque se les ha enunciado y se les llama de otra manera, pero en varios casos vemos que la dinámica continúa siendo la misma dinámica de los años 80, de los años 90, estructuras paraestatales, estructuras que defienden intereses de grandes compañías multinacionales que defienden intereses de grandes capitales internacionales. Entonces allí, digamos que si bien en los 90 celebramos que Naciones Unidas incluyera a comunidades, pueblos y sectores indígenas, comunidades negras, dentro de la lógica de lo que es un defensor de derechos humanos, vemos con bastante preocupación que justamente son los pueblos indígenas y quienes se han elevado en el caso de México y Colombia como organizaciones que defienden los derechos colectivos y los derechos a la naturaleza, han sido principalmente las víctimas. También el tema de esa agudización de los conflictos armados y la lógica de la macrocriminalidad que se da de la misma manera en todos los países. Entonces ahí vemos falta de acceso a la justicia, elevada impunidad, los estados no atienden de ninguna manera las recomendaciones que se hacen por parte de los organismos multilaterales y en ese sentido vemos con gran preocupación que posterior a los acuerdos de paz, y eso lo vimos con varios ejemplos en Centroamérica, en el caso colombiano que se firmó el acuerdo de paz en el año 2016, que pese a estos esfuerzos por la paz, por el contrario, la situación de violación a los derechos colectivos aumenta. Entonces, es un indicador que lo vemos de manera importante y que a su vez mantiene el mismo modus operandi, es la misma forma como los conflictos socioambientales en toda América Latina continúan aún con algunas transformaciones. Por ejemplo, encontramos elementos sobre las prácticas coloniales, los esfuerzos de las grandes movilizaciones en América Latina antes del 2019, post pandemia también, en medio de la pandemia, pues nos muestran que esas prácticas continúan. El destierro, el despojo y el desplazamiento forzado, que están muy conectadas con los agronegocios, con los poseedores de títulos mineros, los poseedores de títulos de operaciones portuarias, operaciones también hidroeléctricas. Allí, no sé si podemos pasar el siguiente mapa. Vemos cómo, pese a que en los últimos 20 años hemos visto una transición en los gobiernos locales, finalmente la intervención de los Estados Unidos desde los años 60 continúa. Es más, logramos hacer algunos balances que tenían que ver un poco más con las políticas económicas y políticas sociales, donde la intervención de los Estados Unidos, digamos, varió en cuanto al discurso, pero en la práctica se mantienen estas estructuras militares desde los años 50 y se mantienen aún incluso donde hay gobiernos progresistas, lo que denominamos progresismos de primera y segunda generación, y donde finalmente, pese a las voluntades locales, quienes ejercen control sobre los territorios, y lo estamos viendo ahorita con los ataques en el Caribe y con los ataques en el Pacífico, donde ya van más de 74 personas muertas, violando todos los pactos, convenios internacionales sobre derecho de gentes y sobre justamente la soberanía de principalmente México, Colombia, Venezuela. Allí vemos cómo se mantienen las bases militares desde los años 50. Eso no ha variado. De hecho, aquí en la base naval de Bahía Málaga, que está sobre el Pacífico colombiano, este gobierno progresista de Gustavo Petro ha tenido conflictos con las comunidades justamente porque se le manifestó la necesidad desde el inicio de gobierno de no permitir una base de los Estados Unidos sobre la isla de Gorgona, pero ahí encontramos esa base militar. Si miramos la siguiente imagen, que ya es no solo Centroamérica y Suramérica, donde efectivamente los conflictos se han reactivado, eh,
Berenice, queda 2 minutos.
listo, encontramos entonces que no son conflictos que están aislados, es decir, para nosotros el problema de la tierra sigue siendo central y para nosotros lo que está pasando en Gaza tiene mucho que ver con lo que está pasando con nosotros. Y lo resumo en lo siguiente por el poco tiempo. El presidente Iván Duque, antecesor del presidente Petro, firmó un tratado de libre comercio con Israel. Este tratado de libre comercio se puso en función en el 2021, donde fuimos víctimas del peor horror de genocidio y juvenicidio, es decir, los jóvenes fueron víctimas de asesinatos producto de esa política de seguridad importada desde Israel. Si podemos pasar a la otra imagen de manera rápida por los 2 minutos que me quedan, miramos unos elementos que considero importantes tener en este foro más adelante. Es algo que ha sido una adelante en el mapa que dice modelos de desarrollo. Nosotros tenemos una situación común en Centroamérica y en Suramérica, y es que los acuerdos comerciales que vienen desde el año 2010, 2000, sí, finales de la década de los 90, comienzos del 2000, están ligados no solo a una política económica, sino también a una política de seguridad. Esa política de seguridad determina los defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos y derechos de la naturaleza que han sido asesinados. Aquí vemos, por ejemplo, 17 tratados de libre comercio. Iniciamos con Canadá, luego Estados Unidos, México, etcétera. Y allí el siguiente mapa, que creo que es muy importante que lo observemos, antes de cerrar, nos determina la cifra de defensores y defensoras de derechos humanos reconocidos como tal, es decir, que han tenido mayor incidencia, que han defendido los derechos humanos, y vemos cómo México, Colombia son los que tienen la mayor cifra. Evidentemente, Colombia es desastroso las cifras que tenemos de asesinatos de defensores y defensoras de la tierra. Y si observamos allí en el siguiente ítem, para cerrar, las políticas están atadas a lo que nosotros denominamos la impunidad programada. ¿Qué es la impunidad programada? La impunidad programada es que genera consecuencias como pobreza extrema, miseria, desempleo, delincuencia común organizada, por eso hablamos de las macroestructuras criminales, migraciones, prostitución, drogadicción, afectaciones en la salud mental. Creo que eso hay que tenerlo como un elemento fundamental en los procesos de solidaridad. Y también la afición al dinero fácil. Están cooptando a nuestros jóvenes a través del dinero, de esas economías ilegales que son las que determinan finalmente el despojo y la violación flagrante de derechos humanos y que terminan en el genocidio del que somos víctimas. Desafíos: lucha por la tierra, lucha por la vida de los derechos humanos, lucha para evidenciar lo que el modelo económico actual está haciendo, buscar que los acuerdos sean cumplidos, así como los pactos y convenios internacionales, y generar una agenda de los pueblos, que es la agenda que nos va a permitir de alguna manera potenciar las resistencias que se tienen en la región. Gracias.
Gracias, Berenice. Mucha información para procesar. Am, la siguiente ponente es Miriam Miranda. Voy a dar un breve biografía. Está en inglés, entonces creo que voy a cambiar el canal de inglés para leerlo. Um, Miriam Miranda is the General Coordinator of the Black Fraternal Organization of Honduras, OFRANE. It's a grassroots organization founded in 1979. Miriam described herself as an activist and human rights defender. She's a legendary, beloved woman leader and a courageous, highly respected defender of the lives, rights, and ancestral lands of the Garifuna people. Um, which has become an increasingly dangerous occupation. At the recent United Nations Forum on Business and Human Rights, not recent, but in 2023, Ofrane and Miriam were recognized with a special award for their outstanding work by human rights defenders addressing the human impacts of business. And so I'm very happy to pass the floor to Miriam. Adelante, Miriam.
Muchas gracias, muchísimas gracias. En primer lugar, agradecer la oportunidad que me dan para compartir con ustedes. Quiero decirles y pedirle muchas disculpas a la coordinación de este foro, porque si bien es cierto, tengo una señal buena, salí del campo muy allá en la jungla para poder hablar con ustedes ahora, pero tengo dificultades a veces para poder, porque estoy más metida en el campo. Gracias a la compañera que hizo una exposición muy amplia, yo solamente quisiera expresar algunas preocupaciones. Yo creo que en este momento hay un quiebre muy importante en hacer, digamos, lo que podemos hacer análisis como movimientos sociales sobre el futuro nuestro como pueblos y comunidades y organizaciones. Y uno de los puntos que quisiera llamar aquí, poner sobre la mesa, es el papel tan poderoso que tiene hoy día los medios de comunicación y las redes sociales. Siento que hace en los años 90 lo veíamos y decíamos que los medios de comunicación era como la última o la primera, y le poníamos categorizábamos lo que serían los medios de comunicación. Yo no creo que a estas alturas, como estamos viviendo, podamos categorizar. Está permeado todo lo que tú decías, la compañera de Colombia decía, o sea, todas las decisiones, como lo decimos aquí en Honduras, ahora a través de las TikTok y todas estas redes sociales están definiendo el futuro de los países, el futuro de estos países nuestros pequeños, porque a través de ahí están generando mucha opinión. O sea, es grave la cosa, es gravísima, y me parece que es tanto así que una se pregunta, por ejemplo, ¿por qué se está normalizando el horror? ¿Cómo es posible que se normalice el horror y que no haya asombro? Ya no hay asombro. O sea, son preguntas que nos hacemos siempre, porque las campañas de odio y el retroceso que tú decías sobre el tema de los derechos humanos tiene que ver con una narrativa que se está construyendo muy fuerte para que la gente no sienta, no haya horror, no sienta asombro, y que se normalice los niveles no solamente de violencia, sino la forma de comportamiento de la sociedad. Ya no tenemos que ver únicamente los gobiernos, los grupos de poder y todo eso, sino que la gente que está a tu lado, o sea, la gente que está con nosotros día a día, desde nuestra familia consanguínea, la gente, ¿cuál es su opinión respecto a todo este horror que está pasando en el mundo? Y en el mundo, no solamente en Gaza, no solamente en Colombia, estamos hablando de ahora, de hoy. Y de por eso es que cuando decía la compañera sobre, por ejemplo, las economías ilegales, o sea, ¿por qué se normaliza tanto el hecho de que el Estado no responda y que hay alguien que tiene mucha plata en los territorios y esa persona da respuesta? Pero ojo, eso se normaliza, eso se ve bien. Y ese entonces uno nos hacemos, hemos hecho preguntas, por ejemplo, ¿qué quiere el joven hoy día? ¿Cuál es su ambición? ¿Cuál es su forma hacia más allá? ¿Cuál es, como digamos, cuál es su referente? Y discúlpenme que toque este tema porque cuando estamos hablando de toda la problemática mundial, de todo lo que está pasando, yo voy a decir, ¿cómo es posible y cómo es posible que Trump sea el presidente de Estados Unidos? Y que además Trump tome decisiones más allá de lo razonable y que no haya una respuesta mundial sobre algo que está haciendo tú. Yo realmente me pongo a pensar, algo está pasando con el planeta, algo está pasando en el mundo, para que nosotros podamos decir, esta persona puede hacer esas aseveraciones y puede decir y hacer, hoy vamos a hacer. Y eso pues, yo creo que es increíble. Hoy estamos destruyendo, por ejemplo, una narcolancha y pum, sale en los medios de comunicación una bomba y todo el mundo se cree ese hecho. ¿Por qué? Porque entonces ahí estamos pasando una situación muy grave en cuanto a lo que nosotros debemos de pensar y analizar sobre cuál es el futuro. Y ahí quiero hablar sobre un tema que tiene que ver con el modo de gobierno. Decía la compañera que hoy tienen las observaciones aquí, excepto la próxima semana tenemos elecciones en un país que está entre el fortalecimiento de un gobierno, no es de izquierda, es que ese es el problema. Nosotros estamos pensando que son de izquierda, no son de izquierda. Aquí es como elegir entre el menos peor. Ahora nos estamos, y se lo digo con propiedad porque desde la OFRANEH estamos apostando a que gane el menos peor para nuestra sobrevivencia organizativa y comunitaria. Mire hasta dónde hemos llegado. ¿Por qué? Porque todos, al final de cuentas, tienen la misma política, tienen la misma funcionalidad. Pero el problema y el meollo del asunto es la forma de gobierno. Tenemos que ser capaces de construir un pacto social de gobernanza diferente, porque nosotros tenemos como referencia ese pacto del norte, que es la forma electoral, pero realmente no funciona. Está totalmente agotado, pero está tan metido en la psiquis de la gente que todos los años cada 4 años decimos, la forma de gobierno es ir a elegir. ¿Qué elegimos? Ese es otro punto que quería decir yo, porque me parece que es crucial en este momento. La referencia que tenemos es ir cada 4 años. Y pare de contar, la compañera ha sido muy específica sobre lo que pasa en América Latina y lo que vemos en Centroamérica. ¿Cómo es posible que Bukele se presente como el hombre más importante para salvar El Salvador? La dictadura que tenemos en Nicaragua, eso nadie lo puede negar cuando el momento que hay una crisis. Entonces, este es un punto claro. Quiero terminar porque no me voy a extender mucho y quiero retomar lo primero para darles un ejemplo de lo que está pasando. Hay mucha información sobre la situación que estamos viviendo como pueblos y organizaciones y movimientos que estamos en la primera fila, siempre luchando contra poderes y el conflicto que hay entre la propiedad privada y la propiedad colectiva comunitaria. Ese es un tema que casi nadie le gusta, pero es un tema crucial en estas democracias, porque los empresarios, llámese con lo que sea en cualquier país, ellos ven como un peligro las luchas y el peligro, las reivindicaciones y lo que nosotros demandamos, que es el respeto a los derechos colectivos comunitarios. OFRANEH tiene 3 sentencias de la Corte Interamericana ganadas. 3 sentencias y vamos por la 4ª. Me dirán ustedes si esas sentencias han sido cumplidas. Pregúntenme si se han sido cumplidas. ¿Y quiénes son los que se oponen a que se cumplan? O sea, estamos en una situación que tiene que ver precisamente con el fortalecimiento de un sistema fascista a nivel de cada país, unos menos, otros más, y lo vemos con las elecciones, cómo van perdiendo la izquierda, cómo van perdiendo la llamada izquierda, ¿va? Que al final no entiendo eso, pero cómo van perdiendo los otros y cómo se va fortaleciendo esos poderes que hay en, en los países nuestros y que tiene que ver más con lo más grande que para ellos es, que es la empresa privada y que tiene que ver con el consumo y que tienen que asegurar que los pueblos sigamos consumiendo aunque no tengamos nada más que ofrecer nuestro cuerpo. Eso ustedes lo han estudiado perfectamente, pero hoy día ha llegado a un nivel en el cual nos, a través de las redes sociales, están legitimando más que nunca ese plan, ese sistema que nos hace ser menos humanas cada día. Porque aquí lo que priva ahora es que la humanidad es la que tenemos que tirar al traste y que tenemos que fortalecer ese sistema capitalista, ese sistema de consumo que nos lleva al desastre y que está comprobado que en ese ritmo no vamos a tener otro planeta. No hay otro planeta. Por mucho que los grandes quieran ir a la luna y van a ir a hacer lo mismo. Si ya sabemos que lo que quieren es acabar con todo lo que sea ser viviente, y por eso es que yo creo que es importante el debate de estas discusiones que se están dando ustedes.
Miriam, queda
Repito,
2 minutos.
ya terminó, que yo creo que es importante avanzar en la discusión sobre la respuesta que están dando y que estamos dando desde los territorios, porque eso es una cosa real. Hay ahí diferentes iniciativas que estamos con esa gran, digamos, lucha y esa gran presión desde todos los niveles para luchar, para poder defendernos, porque el Estado no es garantía. Vivimos en estados fallidos, porque el poder económico, el poder del crimen organizado es el que manda en los territorios, es el que tiene control en los países nuestros. Yo solo quería decir eso, discúlpenme compañeras y compañeros, de a lo mejor me pasé de lo que tenía que decir. Un placer.
Thank you, Miriam. And now we will pass to the north. Our next speaker is Adam Isacson. Adam has worked on defense, security, and peace building in Latin America since 1994. He now directs the defense oversight. Meli, I think you are on the wrong channel. Oh no, I'm on the wrong channel. My apologies. Disculpe, I'm sorry. I was in the Spanish channel. I will start over again. So Adam has worked on defense, security, and peace building in Latin America since 1994. He now directs the Defense Oversight Program of the Washington Office on Latin America, WOLA, which monitors U.S. cooperation with Latin America's security forces and other security trends. These have included Central America's peace processes, the U.S. relationship with Colombia, border security, migration, and efforts to guarantee citizen security without sacrificing rights or democracy. Adam's work has involved dozens of monitoring visits to Colombia, Mexico, and Guatemala, and he is a highly experienced and eloquent advocate who has testified to the U.S. government and Congress. He is also the host of the long-running podcast Latin America Today, which perhaps if you have time, Adam, you can put the link to that in the chat before the panel finishes. But at this point, take it away, Adam. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Kathy. It's great to see everybody. Un gran gusto ver a Berenice. I'm just going to reflect for a little bit about what we're looking at here in the United States. It's been a year that none of us would have really expected. Whenever anybody asks me how I'm doing, I say I'm okay, but then I sound like some sort of sociopath. How could I be okay? But we're hanging in there here at the Washington Office on Latin America and in the community at large. We'll see how we do next year. I'm just going to talk about, the sort of how all these things the Trump administration are doing are sort of fitting together rather than just do a checklist of all the horrors and denuncias of what's been going on. And then maybe some reflections on how WOLA and others are confronting it. Here, WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, has been around for more than 50 years. And really for that time, the Cold War, et cetera, a key goal of ours was always to limit or stop, or at least get transparency over the aid that the United States was giving to militaries and police forces in Latin America that commit human rights abuse with impunity. Well, now they've cut out the middleman. Really, for the first time in our careers in a major way, the United States is carrying out the human rights violations, the grave human rights violations themselves directly. And of course, Exhibit A for that so far has been the boat strikes. Rather than share my screen, maybe I'll just drop some graphics in the chat. If that doesn't work, I'll share my screen. Oh, there's nothing you really haven't seen before. 21 boat strikes so far, 83 people killed, and that's the latest count that we have. And of course, to that you have to add other illegal activities like the rendition of 252 Venezuelan men in our country, many of them asylum seekers with no due process, straight to the Secot prison in El Salvador, and many other efforts to add to that number that have been stopped in the courts. This is a new level of illegality. It's a new level of ignoring, basically almost a century of human rights learning, human rights jurisprudence. And it's going to keep happening for at least a little while longer, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. But yeah, I mean, next year it's going to hit the Western Hemisphere particularly hard. In the Defense Department, headed by Pete Hegseth, every 4 years they draw up a national defense strategy. And that strategy, since it was the Cold War was the main mission, and then the War on Terror after the September 11th attacks was the main mission. More recently, they have put sort of the marquee top tier mission of the Pentagon as China and Russia and other great powers. Apparently the document that I guess they're in spell check, they're in the last few stages of doing, is going to put the U.S. homeland and the Western Hemisphere as the first tier of security threats and for Defense Department activity in the region. So the idea of having more than 10% of the U.S. Navy in the Caribbean, the biggest military deployment in the region since either the 1994 Haiti crisis or the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, may be something that we have to get used to. The idea of the Trumpers being that, America first, of course, that means Western Hemisphere first, apparently. It means that they're viewing the world as spheres of influence, backyards, and any other power that tries to exert themselves in the US in the Western Hemisphere, or any leader that tries to defy the United States in the Western Hemisphere, is going to be met with maximum aggression. The flip side of that is if Russia wants to have a chunk of Ukraine, or if China perhaps wants to take Taiwan, there might not be as much of a response from the United States as they pull back to our hemisphere. So spheres of influence, it's like the 1800s all over again, a return to gunboat diplomacy in the region with, and the expectation, at least. We could talk about divisions in the Trump administration. I find it boring, but the idea of Marco Rubio, for instance, is that Venezuela would be the first domino to fall to regime change, and then Nicaragua and Cuba after that. And they would build a bloc of like-minded leaders around the region. They've already got Javier Milei in Argentina, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador to some extent, Noboa in Ecuador. It looks like you might have Cast, the Pinochetista, who's is leading the elections in Chile. There are very strong populist, right-wing populist oppositions in Brazil and Colombia, the Bolsonaristas, the Uribistas. There's also a return to that 1980s view of the war on drugs. Forget about harm reduction, forget about treatment and treating your addicted population like people who need assistance. It's just say no, it's mass incarceration, and it's what they like to call kinetic operations overseas. So maybe I'm giving the 1980s a bad rap because actually the United States military wasn't directly killing people for the drug war in the 1980s, although they were certainly aiding some security forces that did. Um, and there's a belief that you can solve problems without regard to human rights, without regard to a democratic institutionality, but you can solve very complex problems with very complicated causes just by swinging a sledgehammer at it. The Bukele approach to crime being something that my current government praises very much. Lock up 3% of your male population and watch the homicide rate go down, at least in the short term. Obviously, this is the sort of thing you're really just sweeping under the rug, and there's a lot of dirt under the rug right now. But that drone strike approach to drug trafficking, they actually genuinely believe that they are deterring drug traffickers by making it more deadly to try to take go-fast boats across the Caribbean, as though there were not other ways to bring drugs. Add to that the narco-terrorism frame. That is a word that was a term first coined by Ronald Reagan's ambassador to Colombia in the 1980s. But it conflates organized crime and terrorism. It assumes that they can be fought the same exact way, when, of course, organized crime depends heavily on corrupt relationships with governments and big economic powers and people in the state at all levels, whereas terrorism tends to actually oppose the state. But if you don't understand that difference, you're going to lose. But narco-terrorism is a very handy way, if you are Donald Trump and his supporters, to find a justification for expanding presidential power without congressional review. Sorry about that. Without congressional review of what is a real terror threat. Finding a reason or a pretext to use military force to kill civilians whom you don't like because you've labeled them as terrorist. And then making those illegal orders to the armed forces, who never played this kind of role in the United States really before, making those illegal orders legal by having your Justice Department, which used to be independent as a matter of norms, but now is an appendage of the White House, having your Justice Department issue Office of Legal Counsel opinions, making those illegal orders legal and making it so any acting officer who defies them could be court-martialed, which is why you just saw the commander of Southern Command end his career, rather than try to follow these orders. And if that is what they're going to do, declare an enemy terrorist, use the military against them, get legal opinions to back it up. Okay, you can do that in the Caribbean. You can do that in Venezuela. You can also do it in Chicago. You can also do it in Boston. Because there will be protesters, there will be people opposing the Trump administration, and they may be putting in place what they need to use the military against U.S. citizens at home. I know that sounds hysterical, but it's been a rough year here. We're getting hysterical. Now, that has gone hand in hand with the belief that foreign assistance is corrupt and bloated and must be eliminated. And it's interestingly, they've cut a lot of military assistance too to the region, except to their really good friends in the sort of MAGA adjacent part of Latin America. But Colombia is Exhibit A. Colombia was getting about $450 to $500 million of assistance every year. It was majority non-military, really, for the first, that started after the peace accord. And now it's maybe getting between 100 and 150. It got slashed deeply in January, February, March when when Trump and Rubio cut aid to most of the world, but Colombia and many other countries in the region were particularly hit. So there's not much left to punish Colombia with as far as aid cuts go. And this all goes hand in hand with a deep hostility to transparency and oversight, and even just giving basic information to Congress, much less the public and the media, about what is going on. So in this context, I mean, there's reasons for real pessimism. Some of our biggest institutions are failing us and even supporting what's happening right now. Corporations in Silicon Valley, anybody who has big contracts or mergers or licenses that they need in order to keep going is getting in line. With only a few exceptions. And I'm sure you all saw the whole Jimmy Kimmel controversy and other things like that. That stuff's happening all the time. Some big media outlets are succumbing, often because they are owned by these billionaire corporations. Some big philanthropy that often supports the progressive or reformist cause is being very, very cautious and very scared and aiming to do things that are less controversial and maybe just sort of, have more glitzy conferences where people just say mild things instead of anything that really directly challenges this agenda. A lot of moderate Democrats, as we saw with the caving in on the budget shutdown, are also haven't really adjusted to the new reality. They haven't really, they're not really with us yet. Although those numbers
Adam,
are
there's 2 more minutes.
great. There are signs of hope. Our judiciary, not the Supreme Court, but most of our judiciary has been finding against the Trump administration on some key issues. There's been major popular mobilizations, more protests than we saw during the first year of the Trump administration. The off-year election outcomes at the beginning of November were great. The polling was good. Not that the Democratic Party has captured people's imagination, but most people are really alarmed about where we are headed as a country right now. And the coalitions that WOLA and others are working in are important. So I'm just going to talk about that work for as much as I can in the next minute and a half and just cut me off. But how WOLA is working, I mean, it is an adverse media environment. Although we do talk to the media a lot, we don't sure we get through to public opinion at large to the extent that we used to. It's an adverse funding environment, as I mentioned. Almost every organization from us to Human Rights Watch to many others have been letting people go, and almost everybody in the coalition, even the ones that were not getting U.S. government assistance like us, have had to shrink in the last few years. So the big challenge is to work in coalition as much as possible to lend each other strengths, but not duplicate what other people are doing. That image of the 7-year-olds all running after the soccer ball instead of splitting roles and covering different zones, you can't do that anymore. And so that is a big deal. If somebody else is doing an okay job, just do something else. Without fueling any violent solutions, we have to condemn anti-democratic practice and rights violations wherever they occur. That means in left-wing governments and in right-wing governments. If there's corruption, if there's human rights abuse, we have to be even-handed. That often angers governments. It often angers some coalition partners, but it is crucial. We have to maintain our credibility. We have to be uplifting wherever possible. It can't just be denuncia all the time. It can't just be, this litany of bad things that are happening. We have to be uplifting democratic and rights respecting alternatives at all levels. If there's a mayor somewhere who's got a really good public security program that is working without locking up the population, we should be uplifting that mayor's work, right? And there's a million examples like that, but I don't have time to get into. But uplifting the brave social movements like you guys are doing with everybody on this panel who's not me is an incredibly important thing to do right now. And addressing some really hard to unpack questions. How do you protect people from crime without violating human rights and democracy in the short term so that people feel safer in a few months? That's a hard one. How do you hold your border forces accountable so we don't ever see what's happening now happen again? How do you get real deep drug law reform while pursuing harm reduction, without killing people in the process? How do we encourage, democratic openings without U.S. interventions? How do we root out corruption and on which organized crime thrives when power really depends on that in so many countries? So, we can talk about products. You've seen, we do a lot of research. We try to write it as clearly as possible so like a reasonably bright ninth grader can understand it. Although the text format works less and less in this day of people scrolling their phones and watching videos and listening to podcasts. So we try all of that, and we're on the learning curve, frankly, on communications. And finally, just the intangible stuff is so important. The field research, constant back and forth with partners who are often facing some of the same problems in their own countries, the same threats, constant interplay with congressional staff, making sure that the squishy Democrats get less and less squishy and that the progressive Democrats remain really strong, and that we occasionally peel off some moderate Republicans. And yeah, I mean, just the journalist work, the coalition work, that's all intangible, but it is so crucial to what we're doing. Sorry to rush the end there where I talk about what we're doing, but I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. Thanks for letting me go over time too.
Thank you, Adam. I was just about to step in. So thank you very much for painting that situation. The next panelist we have is Jen Moore, who is familiar to many of the people in the APG because she was so active with the APG when she worked with Mining Watch in Ottawa. But Jen is now based in Mexico City and working with the Institute for Policy Studies. The Institute carries out public scholarship to support advocacy towards a more equitable, ecologically sustainable, and peaceful society. As an associate fellow with the IPS's Mining and Trade Project, Jen supports frontline struggles over mining and other extractivist projects in Mesoamerica and Colombia. She also works to support the movement to abolish secretive corporate courts that allow transnational corporations to wield power over decision makers. In addition to her work with the IPS, Jen is a member of the women's collective called the Rhizome Weaving Defense of the Commons, o Rizoma Tejiendo la Defensa de los Bienes Comunes. And Jen is going to give us a bit of analysis about the new Carney government's policies towards the Americas. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you, everybody. And I'm humbled and really appreciative to be part of the conversation today, and really appreciate the overview that Berenice and Miriam and Adam have provided, and just want to share some reflections. I think you all have. This will draw on some of the work that APGL is already doing, and some of the things that we're seeing from IPS around trade and investment in the region, particularly from Canadian corporations, and some reflections from where I sit here in Mexico City and some of the things going on specifically here in light of the increasing threats to land and environment defenders that Berenice has described so well, the wild expansion of organized crime, and the way in which the Canadian government is just absolutely failing to step up to the very grave moment that we're facing. And I think, while the Canadian government has been waving a patriotic flag in response to Trump's economic threats, that what we're seeing being reinforced in Canadian foreign policy is not terribly unlike what we've seen before under Harper, then somewhat under Trudeau, and that just does not it has not updated itself to this moment. And I think it can still be summed up as largely focused on trying to maximize the profits of Canadian financed corporations and to promote further investment, especially in mining, energy, and infrastructure, but also other sectors of the economy, depending on the specific country, and very much within the same old neoliberal framework of free trade, privatization, and deregulation that has really laid the context prior to this exaggerated sort of moment of so much war and rising fascism and extreme right politics and ongoing genocide, but that underlies a lot of the ongoing conflicts and risks to land and environment defenders in particular. I mean, it really feels like we have a CEO in Canada, not a prime minister, whose politics remain very corporate driven, fundamentally neo-colonial, both in Latin America, but also at home. I mean, I think this is very much reflected in the domestic policy direction to rush through mega projects across the country, and giving First Peoples just an afterthought, despite all of the hard work to put the necessity for a real reckoning with Canada as a colonial settler society on the table. I think it continues to be very opportunist and open to dealing with repressive far-right regimes, such as work that you all have been doing so hard to lift up the negotiations of a new free trade agreement with Ecuador under President Daniel Noboa, and falls extraordinarily short of the dangerous extraditional killings that Adam has described for us in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean, that are this dangerous conflation between crime and war to start to designate organized crime as narco-terrorists, and the implications of that, and the very clear implications of that leading toward more death and militarization in the region. And just a pause here, I think there are others that are probably way better positioned to speak to Canada's defense policy, but I'm pretty shocked and upset, like, and worried about the unprecedented increase in the Canadian defense budget. And I do think that this was pointed out, I think, in the APG's latest letter on the boat strikes, but that we need to probably go a lot further to carefully examine who's benefiting in the weapons industry, where the arms are going to go, and how the Canadian government's leaning toward further security integration in North America could deepen Canadian complicity in imperial political interference, violence, and militarization in the region. We know that there's a past of police training and other programs in Honduras and Colombia. It's named in the Canada-Mexico Action Plan. And I think this moment deserves a special focus on that I can't go deeply on, but I think is really vital. So just to comment a bit more in depth on the area of Canadian foreign policy that I'm more familiar with, it seems that even minor measures that the Canadian government previously promoted to presumably address corporate impunity, not to say that it did, and also to presumably ensure respect for the rights of peoples and communities affected by Canadian investments, these seem to have pretty much fallen aside, with worn out, useless approaches making a comeback, voluntary standards, and just complete silence when people are being threatened. And while we're seeing affected people lack any access to justice, the government just continues to be a cheerleader for the neo-colonial and highly controversial investment protection system that enables transnational corporations to sue governments, not only to make millions of dollars through these cases, but to really impose their interests by forcing negotiations like they're doing in Panama over a major copper mine. And I think too, questioning some of the recent announcement out of Colombia of a negotiated agreement with Aris Mining over mining in the area of Marmato, where there's been a history of conflict, and why these negotiations are taking place behind closed doors when they affect hundreds of thousands of people who have been organized to defend their collective rights for many years. So just a couple of specific observations with regards to just reflecting on the negotiations of the free trade agreement with Ecuador. This feels very harkens back to what happened when Canada took advantage of its relationship with Alvaro Uribe to force through the free trade agreement in Colombia, and then after the military-backed coup gave rise to the narco dictatorship in Honduras, it did something very similar. And amongst other things, important other things, but these agreements include the investor-state dispute settlement that allows transnational corporations to unilaterally sue governments. And that's still being considered, even though being unconstitutional in the Ecuador-Canada Free Trade Agreement. And I think it's just important to point out here that investor-state dispute settlement, or ISDS, as it's frequently referred to, has been widely criticized by academics, jurists, members of the US Congress, UN Special Rapporteurs, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And it's been noted and documented how it's detrimental to respect for human rights, corporate accountability, climate, environmental justice, and all the range of measures that governments need to be able to use to better regulate and manage their economies. And we know that the sectors most prone to making use of this are energy and mining, oil and gas sectors. In the last year, 60% of the new ISDS cases that were brought against governments around the world came from these two sectors. And we're seeing how this is being wielded by Canadian companies over water protection in Colombia, over people demanding another economic model in Panama, leading to the closing of the First Quantum's copper mine. And then also in sectors that have been privatized, like a toll booth highway just outside of Lima, where Brookfield, where Carney used to work, is now suing Peru. And we also saw at the beginning of this year where Brookfield stepped up to put some pressure on the Colombian government over energy reforms to stabilize energy prices, after having bought out, I think, some of the biggest hydroelectric projects in the country. So it's being used in a number of sectors to powerfully enforce corporate sway over what governments are deciding to do. And just by way of a small stat, of the 80 known or so claims that have been brought by Canadian firms globally, around half of those are against governments in Latin America. And just a very brief comment too, I think, about how the economic agenda is just trumping absolutely everything. Mexico has been the clearest priority, I think, in terms of Canadian foreign policy of late. There's been a lot of high-level visits back and forth since June, as the Carney government has prioritized building a relationship with the government of President Sheinbaum to try to team up in the efforts to maintain the North America Free Trade Agreement intact. And in that context, again, I just think that it was very evident the absence of care or consideration for the context that is in Mexico. There was an announcement of the 2025-2028 Canada-Mexico Action Plan at the time of Carney's visit in September to Mexico. There are only two brief references to human rights in the entirety of that document. One is in reference
Two minutes left, Jen.
Okay. One is in reference to the seasonal agricultural work program, and another with regards to initiatives that the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives supports. There was nothing in terms of security. And least of all, in terms of what are the implications of Canadian extractive investments in territories of the country that are now controlled by these organized criminal networks, where people are not able to fully exercise their rights and are, if they're not sort of being placed under direct attacks. And this is where I think sometimes the numbers of assassinations doesn't capture the massivity and the way that the risks to people defending their land and water and ways of life is just not fully captured. So I think this is one of the ways in which Canadian investors can avoid any serious questioning of who's benefiting from these contexts of extreme violence. And there's also no mention of human rights in the context of environment and sustainability within the plan, despite the dire risks to land and environment defenders. And I think we can come up with other examples. The Mining Watch is putting together an article now about threats against land and environmental defenders in Santander, Colombia. And despite letters from UN special rapporteurs, the Canadian government simply hasn't responded. It just feels like this is all an afterthought. And just, I guess, finally, and to wrap up, and maybe just one small point before I do that, there's also been a huge ongoing conflict here in the center of Guerrero, which is another part of the country that's controlled by organized crime, involving a Canadian company based in Vancouver, Equinox Gold. This was very much at the height. President Sheinbaum had been questioned about it when Carney was in Mexico, in September. And Carney's response was basically to ask for a list of companies that haven't been abiding by environmental rules so that Canada could talk to them. And just a few weeks ago, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce put out a statement, and it's not just companies that sit in that space. The Canadian Embassy also sits in that space. And they declared their commitment to the Mining Association of Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining standard, which has been highly criticized, not only by Mining Watch Canada, not only by organizations in British Columbia, where this has been tried to use to greenwash mining industry in Canada too, but also by international studies looking at the weakness of these voluntary mechanisms that do not work. So we're just seeing this terrible regression, and I think how Canadian policy just is not stepping up at all to the moment, and the absurd idea from Foreign Affairs Minister to say that it's up to the U.S. to decide on the legality of these unjustifiable extrajudicial killings in the Caribbean, I think just speaks to the depths Canada is willing to go to protect its economic interests at all costs to Great Britain. And I'll just wrap up there. Thanks.
Thank you, Jen. And so what proceeds next? We've covered really wide range of context. We're going to open the floor for a few questions. I ask people to try and keep the questions short so that we can get a few in.
And Steve,
And say,
will you also do the land acknowledgement and the screenshot that we wanted to do?
yeah, maybe we should wrap the questions first because I'm worried about running out of time, and then we can do the screen. So we open it to some questions, and then in order to allow the speakers to prepare their responses, that's when we'll do the screenshots and the land acknowledgement that I forgot to do at the beginning of the panel. And then we'll give each of the speakers 2 to 3 minutes to respond and wrap up. So if you have questions or please raise your hand. For some reason, I can't seem to get it onto the, oh, there we are, gallery. I should be able to see the yellow hand, but if you want to put your physical hand up, that would be fine too. And there are 2 pages, so if I'm not responding and you do have your hand up, it may be because I missed it, and feel free to just jump in. I think Nadia is the first person. Go ahead, Nadia.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Hola. Hola a todos. Yes, my question is, yes, seeing the current situation and the political situation that is not in favor of the people who are fighting for the very basic human rights and environment. What, for example, for Ada and also Berenice and Miriam, what could be the response that you will expect from the unions, for example, from the labor union, for the labor movement in Canada or around the world? Because I know that we as a worker, we have a lot of power if we were get organized and we move, we have a kind of goal, you know? And sometimes it's difficult to talk about international solidarity, you know? And there is a lot of work that we need to do to mobilize the grassroots, the rank and file, because the neoliberal agenda, as we know, is affecting also Canada. We are seeing the destruction of the welfare state here. We are seeing the worsening of the labor rights and also the human rights. Even, you know, in less than 3 years, we have going so back, no? I remember in 2020, the main mobilization were for the environmental issues or the LGBT community rights. But now we are just fighting for the more basic, that is, for example, have a job, you know, and we are seeing the cuts of the budget and the municipal level, provincial level, and federal, and putting all that money in NATO. What Jane was talking about, no? How much money this government is putting in NATO and defunding all the rest of social services. So I guess that we also in North America and in Canada, we are gonna have a kind of estallido social, right? Like a happen also in Colombia, maybe. I don't know if we had to be so, you know, bad condition to wake up and go on the street and fight, no? Because I think the only one who can change things is in general the mass, no? The peoples. So yes, what do you expect from the social movements and the labor movement, for example, in North America?
Thank you, Nadia. Does anyone else have a question? Check over here. Go ahead, Kathy.
Maybe to add to what Nadia has said, I mean, first of all, to say to all 4 of our speakers, like, I'm just kind of like, wow. I mean, very, very powerful presentations by all of you. Very disturbing panorama. So good to have you lay out for us the connections. We talked about that earlier in our meeting about the need to have a analysis that joins the dots. I guess building on Nadia's question, mine is for an organization like ours, what should we be prioritizing as we together with all of you confront these realities? Like in what ways can we well, I mean, I guess I'll just leave it as an open-ended question about ways that we can work together and the priorities for that action. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Other questions? Maybe this will be the last chance. I'll check on the other page. All right. Well, thank you for those questions. In order, well, in order to cover up my error, we're going to give the panelists a minute or two to sort of think about their responses while I read the land acknowledgement that I was supposed to read at the beginning of the panel. And while I'm doing that, I would also encourage people to turn on their screens. You don't have to, but it would be nice if you did, so that Laura can do a couple of screenshots of the general meeting that we can share with people who weren't able to attend. All right. This is the land acknowledgement that should have been at the beginning. As we gather virtually for this meeting, we acknowledge that we're joining from different locations across Canada, Turtle Island, and also from the lands of our partners in Latin America. In Canada, we acknowledge the traditional territories of the many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who have stewarded the land for more than 15,000 years. We specifically recognize the history of the treaties and agreements that cover much of the land that we now call Canada, and we commit to upholding our responsibility to these original caretakers. Land acknowledgements ask us to be mindful and reflect on our shared history, relationships, and place. Many of us are settlers to Turtle Island who have benefited from the land's resources, wealth, and opportunities. It is our shared responsibility as settlers to continue caring for the land we live and work on, and to always act in solidarity with Indigenous communities in their continued quest for justice, truth, and reconciliation. We extend our acknowledgement and respect to our partners joining us from Latin America. We recognize that the lands they stand on have also been profoundly affected by global colonialism and historical injustices. This shared history of impact binds our work together. As an organization dedicated to social justice and solidarity, we understand that true liberation requires dismantling of systems of oppression wherever they exist. We reaffirm our commitment to being respectful partners and allies in upholding the inherent rights and sovereignty of Indigenous peoples across these territories. Thank you. And Laura, did you get the shots?
We got a few in case.
Okay.
No, I need, because I had a last minute transition with my daughter, need to bring her to her camp. Can somebody else do the screenshot?
I think I got
but
them.
Jessica got some? Okay.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So then we will proceed to the last part of the panel, which is the responses from our panelists. We ask you to try and keep them to 2 to 3 minutes. I won't be too strict though, but we will begin with Berenice.
Bueno, yo creo que la respuesta inicial es justamente este foro. Este foro abre las expectativas y la esperanza a decir, no nos callamos ante la opresión, ante el colonialismo, ante el imperialismo. Las preguntas hechas las agradezco todas, tienden también a reafirmar la importancia de la educación, de la investigación, de la organización y la lucha. Y yo creo que el recorrido de todas las organizaciones y de todas las personas que estamos aquí presentes han tenido que ver con nuestros aportes históricos a una postura ética frente a la humanidad. Y esa postura ética nos llama a tener latidos de esperanza, o si no, nos tocaría que el último cierre la puerta, es decir, ante el impacto, o sea, a mí la exposición que hace Adam me genera tantas preocupaciones como las que hace Jean, pero tenemos que hacerlo, o sea, tenemos que decir lo que está pasando justamente para poder ahondar en las profundidades, en las causas estructurales de lo que se ha vivido. Y nadie lo decía, o sea, la fuerza del trabajo de los pueblos trabajadores han generado esa solidaridad, yo digo esa solidaridad eficaz, porque la solidaridad eficaz, y yo veo aquí muchos amigos y amigas conectados que han sido históricamente solidarios. Está Luis Castleman, está Katy Price, que conoce Colombia desde hace mucho tiempo, está Kelty, están todas estas organizaciones, Steven, que tuvo que soportar muchas traducciones sobre los tratados de libre comercio y los impactos sobre nuestro país. Y me encantaría nombrarlos a cada uno, pero yo creo fielmente en la solidaridad y creo fielmente, y voy a prender en este momento esta velita, en que el latido de la esperanza está en que los pueblos del mundo nos unamos, no olvidemos nunca, nunca, nunca a nuestros compañeros y compañeras que han muerto, que han sido asesinados, no han muerto, han sido asesinados, desaparecidos, privados ilegalmente de la libertad por luchar contra las injusticias. El pueblo palestino para nosotros es el motor de la vida y de la lucha. La Global Sumud Flotilla es una canción de esperanza ante gobiernos imperialistas. Las palabras de Miriam sobre la juventud, sobre los niños, sobre la esperanza, creo que son fundamentales. Entonces, creo que las respuestas las tenemos nosotros mismos. Las respuestas son juntarnos, la unidad es fundamental. Y este ejercicio, de verdad, quienes estuvieron trabajando previamente, porque sé los esfuerzos que un ejercicio de estos demanda, es súper importante y tenemos que replicarlos en muchas partes del mundo. Eh, la solidaridad es más que una posibilidad de entrelazar, de tejer las luchas por la liberación de los pueblos. Y yo creo que seguimos luchando por liberar nuestros pueblos.
Muchas gracias, Berenice. Palabras muy fuertes. Ah, Miriam, paso la palabra a Miriam.
Muchísimas gracias. Es un gran placer haberme conectado con ustedes y yo quiero decir algo que no lo había dicho, porque también por respeto a ustedes, quiero decirles que una de las grandes luchas que estamos enfrentando como OFRANEH es contra un grupo de empresarios canadienses en Honduras. Algunos de ustedes ya escucharon sobre el rey del porno. Y este es una cosa que nos ha asumido toda la bahía de Trujillo, toda, absolutamente toda la bahía de Trujillo. En los últimos años hemos venido enfrentando una situación gravísima, gravísima porque supuestamente nos traen el desarrollo. Randy Jorgensen y otros empresarios que han venido a apoderarse de los territorios del pueblo garífuna. Y nosotras en una reocupación, porque queremos decirles que tenemos ahora 61 reocupaciones de territorios del pueblo garífuna. En una de las reocupaciones de uno de los lugares donde vivía Randy Jorgensen, encontramos más de 3,000 piezas arqueológicas listas para sacarlas, para trasegarlas. Decirles que también casi no nos damos cuenta que el tráfico de piezas arqueológicas es mucho más grande que incluso el tráfico del narcotráfico. Lo que pasa que eso es legal, ¿verdad? Es legalizado en los países nuestros, pero es un saqueo. Hemos podido comprobar que saquearon hasta tumbas y ahí estaban. Las encontramos gracias a nuestros ancestros, ancestras que nos dieron la luz y estamos luchando para instalar, para que se nos reconozca una custodia a los pueblos indígenas de Honduras en ese lugar que le hemos dicho Hachari, se nombró Hachari por parte del pueblo garífuna, y estamos ahí en esa lucha. Y gracias, Nadia, porque yo creo que quiero terminar diciendo que en el norte, las organizaciones, las personas, yo creo que ustedes saben lo que hay que hacer. A mí cada vez que me preguntan qué puedo hacer, no, yo creo que ustedes saben, solo que hay que hacer un poquito más. Exactamente. ¿Verdad? O sea, al escucharles, por ejemplo, Adam hizo mucho ruido cuando decía, se está generando una jurisprudencia a partir de los ataques a las narcos, a los barcos. Eso fue una cosa que hoy, pues, como todos los días aprendo en la vida, eso es también un aprendizaje para mí, ¿verdad? Entonces yo creo que hay que fortalecer esa lucha que se está haciendo desde todo nuestro espacio, pues, porque no nos queda otra. Y hay una responsabilidad, creo también. Y ahí termino diciendo que creo que vamos a hacer una gira en abril a Canadá y vamos a pedirles que nos reciban, ¿verdad? Para que puedan ustedes acuerparnos, porque la lucha y la fuerza que hay y sobre todo la presión que hay de lo de la propiedad privada contra la propiedad colectiva comunitaria, esa es una cosa que no se quiere entender, que sí los pueblos tenemos derechos ancestrales, comunitarios, territoriales y que tienen que ser respetados. Muchísimas gracias por haberme dado la oportunidad de estar con ustedes, de conocerles. Y Jane, un abrazo, porque Jen sufrió muchísimo con la OFRANEH cuando nos reconocieron, cuando nos dieron el reconocimiento, pues vio lo caótica que somos, ¿verdad? Como organización, pero se pudo hacer esa inauguración porque fuimos a Nueva York a celebrarlo con la comunidad garífuna de Nueva York. Una locura, es que se nos ocurre siempre la locura, y la locura es lo que nos sirve para poder seguir luchando, trabajando, ¿verdad? No hay de otra. Entonces yo recuerdo que Jen dijo, bueno, pero la aguantó. Y dije yo, si la aguantó, puede aguantar todas las cosas que podemos hacer. Un abrazo, Buiti Rambabe, y muchísimas gracias. Sereme.
Gracias, Miriam. Son puntos muy importantes para reflexionar, especialmente como organizaciones canadienses. And it looks like Adam will be able to just squeeze you in before you get your press conference call. So take it away, Adam.
I'll be brief. I mean, how do I follow that? How do I follow these last two speakers? I mean, I have a candle, but I don't even have a match or a lighter. So that's maybe the metaphor that you need right now. But I mean, I thought that was a compelling question. I mean, what's the response that that unions and movements in places like Canada, the United States, and elsewhere should be giving? You know, not to punt that question completely, but we should ask the unions and the social movements in the region how we should be accompanying right now. The responses may be very different in different countries and in different contexts. Some people will be saying, look, we're afraid of being killed. We need basic protection and accompaniment. Some may be saying we're really worried about the plight of women laborers in our industry or our city. Others may be saying, you know, the corruption is so bad, the organized crime collusion is so bad, we need the justice system to actually do something and undergo deep reform. It could be that there are very good laws on the books already to protect forests or to protect workers and others, but they're just ignored and never enforced. And for that, you need a justice system and a lot of outside and inside pressure as well, and accompaniment of people trying to reform their judiciaries to do that. I mean, often that's very boring work that doesn't make the front page, but it ultimately makes the biggest difference in breaking those corrupt links that allow forests to be cut down and allow these mining projects to go forward and allow, the drug boats to be waved down the river. So that's where a lot of the work may be, but it depends on what people in the region are telling you the work should be with the people that you're accompanying. Of course, make sure that your state is not on the wrong side of all of this, as mine is almost consistently down the line right now. A great example is your recent denunciations of Canada's incredibly disappointingly weak response to the U.S. boat strikes. While the UK, France, and the Dutch are limiting their intelligence cooperation with the United States, that's the statement we get out of a center or center left government in Canada. That's completely unacceptable, and you are very much in your right and should be screaming about it, and making headlines about how inadequate that is, and calling people out by name, even if you need them for some other things, other reforms on occasion. But also, in addition to the denuncia, as I said before, we have to, I'm going to go crazy if all I do is denuncia all the time. We have to uplift alternatives. We have to show better ways of doing things. Our opposition party in the United States is not great at that right now. The message still seems to be, let's just go back to 2024. Well, 2024 sucked too. And so we have to get better at holding up alternatives. And that, again, comes often from the partners in the region who are fighting for real democracy with accountability, who are getting information out there that is very hard to uncover otherwise, which we can be doing for them as well. Like, here's what the United States is about to do with the boat strikes. Who are fighting for real demilitarization, to get civilians in charge of things, that instead of having men with guns and uniforms do everything. Who are, and one thing that we all have to work on, and advice from the region might not be as key toward it, is our own strategies, especially our communication strategies. The communications environment has changed so much. Getting a column in the New York Times used to be able to move several senators. It doesn't now. It's often it could be a video, it could be a really good series of tweets, it could be but often it's still just plain things you do, communication in real life, being together with people in growing numbers and sharing ideas. But what combination of communication strategies works right now at a very strange time when people are spending 6 hours or more a day on their phones, is something that we have to figure out, because it's a different way of doing activism. It's a little depressing, but it's part of the strategy. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Adam. And to conclude, I'll invite Jen to respond. Adelante, Jen.
Thanks, Steve. I want to, I guess I really concur with a lot of what Adam has just said, and I really appreciate the comments both from Berenice and Miriam. I just want to underscore, and I think especially, the importance of staying attuned to partners' specific needs and priorities and projects. I mean, those are the alternatives. There's a world of alternatives in all of these struggles on the ground across Latin America. But I think just it's been coming home to me, especially with the proliferation of AI and talk about influencers and different sort of strategies to get the word out on things, that nothing replaces. And I think we just have to keep coming home to the importance of these long-term relationships based on solidarity. That's where our trust and our understanding of what's going on comes from. And it's where our trust and ability to be responsive and to craft and develop effective strategies and campaigns comes from too. So I agree too that we have to figure out how to use some of the new technologies and figure out what of that is useful, but also not give up the other that I just, I think all of the relationships that have been built so deeply and over so many years, through BTS and other organizations in Guatemala, in Colombia, in El Salvador, in Honduras, in Mexico, all of that is what enables the work that the APG does. And to the extent that we can continue to invest and build those relationships, I think that's so important. I feel like there's been a lot of breakage amongst networks and these relationships, especially since the pandemic, not only because of the pandemic. I think there's a lot of fragmentation that's also happened under these in progressive governance as much as in the the governments that are amongst the rising fascist right wing. And so looking for these opportunities to connect in person where possible and to build unity or rebuild unity or find opportunities for that again, I think is just vital and not easy. I feel like though it's a challenge. But I think one of the things that, in coming to Nadia's question, and this isn't an answer, it's just something that's been going around in my head, and I think has come up in a number of places, and I feel like it also draws a thread between the real unaffordability and difficulty of getting by day to day in Canada right now, the real threats that people are facing. I wonder, like, I feel like the austerity budget that we just saw is part of the military budget increase. Like the two things are very directly related. And instead of spending this unprecedented 5% of the budget on, and giving that basically to weapons manufacturers and sidling up to the US's, larger defense sort of strategy, insane and militaristic strategy, I think like if there has to be something around that. I think the militarization thread and pushing against the military budget and everything that sort of kind of manifestations of that. So like we have austerity, we can't afford a care economy, we can't afford real responses to the ecological collapse, we can't afford all sorts of things because we're pouring it in there. And we're also, and weapons manufacturing, I think so much mining is happening under the guise of the energy transition, but we don't know how much of that's also going into military weapons. I mean, those supply chains are really hard to trace. And so I think there's ways of building a lot of threads around this rising militarization that I think we need to push back on. I think it links, a lot of the foreign policy problems. It can link with frontline communities that are fighting extractive projects. It can link, the climate justice movement, and it can link the unaffordability and austerity that Canadians, working class Canadians are facing. So that's just an idea. And I guess just also, I've been impressed, I think, by the persistence and the creativity of the movement in solidarity with the Palestinian people over the last couple of years in Canada. And I think that kind of persistence and creativity to document, to denounce, and to do it in a multitude of ways in the streets, but also, I mean, some of the tracing there that's been going around about weapons manufacturing in Canada, I think has been really well done. And it has not moved the needle enough, but the Canadian government has been forced to say things that it wasn't saying before. That's not the answer, but we need to be calling that out and doing all that. There's all sorts of other solidarity that's taking place between people in Canada and people in Palestine. And I think similarly, we need to be looking at where we can bolster things, knowing that we all have, ever limited capacity, and knowing that a lot of organizations all over the place are struggling to just survive. I've been talking with colleagues in El Salvador that don't know if they're going to be registered and be able to continue to work into next year. There's a lot of things on the table, but those are some things that come to mind for me.
Thank you. Thank you, Berenice. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Jen.